Thank you, worship team. If you were here last week, we talked about how anytime that anybody takes a gift God has given them and uses it to make something beautiful, that is an act of worship to God. And so I love seeing the worship team with their musical gifts and their vocal gifts doing that, but it's a reminder, and hopefully it's a reminder to all of us, that you don't have to have musical gifts. Any gift God gives you, whether it's a gift of relationships and it shows up in your home or with friends, or if it's a gift of a skill and it shows up at a job or with a craft, any time that we use a gift from God to make something beautiful, we're glorifying Him. So thank you, worship team, especially wind and the cello. It's just awesome, all the gifts we have in this church. And drums, and the drum, man, he rocks it on the drums back there. So, we said that in the book of Exodus, we got these images of things God began with His people. And with the coming of Christ, God is fulfilling and completing what He began. But often, God completes things in unexpected ways. And just like God showed up in unexpected ways in people's lives of old, so also He shows up often unexpectedly in our own lives as well. And we hope that we can become more aware of that this Advent season. So when it comes to Christmas time, we're often reminded of the many different names that were given to Jesus, both at His birth but also throughout His life, right? Different titles, different attributes of who He was. He's the Messiah, He's the Christ, He's the Son of God, He is God on earth, or as I heard one pastor put it, He's God with a bod. It kind of rhymes, it's very clever. But you may not have known this. Jesus was also a ninja. And if you look carefully, you can actually see His crazy mad ninja skills appearing all over the scriptures. There's this story, we're going to look at two stories. There's one, it's in Matthew 22, you don't have to go there yet. But Jesus, at this point in His life and ministry, He's developed quite a big crowd, quite a big following, right? People are impressed, intrigued, excited by what He's doing and what He's teaching. But as you know, whenever somebody gets popular and there's a crowd, they also get some detractors. There are people who don't like what they're doing, who are trying to ruin all the excitement. And Jesus, who had a big crowd, He also had some detractors. One group of the detractors was a group called the Sadducees. And if you, like me, as a child, learned the song, I Just Want to Be a Sheep, you know that the Sadducees were so sad, you see, right? It's very clever. I just want to be a sheep. But did anybody who learned that song as a kid? Okay, good. A few of you. Okay, the rest, I'm sorry for the rest of you. It's a great song. We'll learn later that the Pharisees, they weren't fair, you see. It's really a great song. And actually, it's pretty good. Pretty true. So the Sadducees, who allegedly were so sad, you see, they didn't like Jesus, and they were trying to trap Him. So the Sadducees come to Jesus, and they tell Him this story. They're like, Jesus, there's a guy, and he's married, but the guy dies, and he doesn't have any kids. Now, for the Sadducees, this is a problem, because the Sadducees, and actually many ancient Jews, didn't believe in the resurrection. They believed that when you died, and then that was it. And so if somebody were to have their life carry on after them, the only way that happens is if they have kids. And by having kids, your life continues after your death. That's what the Sadducees believed. But Jesus, at this point in His ministry, had started speaking about and teaching about the resurrection. And the Sadducees didn't like this, so they're going to try and trick Jesus, trap Jesus. So the story continues. They go, okay, so this guy, he dies, but he's not got no kids. Now, the law says that the guy's brother has to marry his wife, which I know is a little different than how we typically do things, but that was the understood custom. The brother had to marry the wife so that hopefully the brother could have kids, and then the guy's life would continue. Well, the Sadducees take it to the next level, and they go, well, it turns out that this guy who died, he had 7 brothers, and every single brother married the wife, didn't have kids, and died. So then the next brother marries the wife, doesn't have kids, and dies. And the next brother, and the next brother, until all 7 brothers had married the same woman, and none of them have had kids. And we're all sitting here being like, okay, super weird. Like, this is just a really, really weird story, but it's all the setup because the Sadducees want to trap Jesus, and so they say, Jesus, you believe there's a resurrection, right? Which one of the guys will be the husband of the wife in the resurrection? And you can see the whole room. They're like, oh, that's such a hard question. What's Jesus going to do? But Jesus, as we know, is a ninja. So he knows how to get out of sticky situations. And Jesus' answer was, you don't understand resurrection. God is not the God of the dead, people who died and whether or not they're married or not married, but rather God is the God of the living. Because Scripture says that Abraham, Isaac, and Joseph, who at that point were all long dead, are currently in a relationship with God, and so God is the God of those who are alive. And apparently this answer completely blew everybody's mind because it says the crowds were amazed. Okay, so the point of that all is to set the scene. I mean, imagine, Jesus is in a public place of some sort, crowds are all around, the Sadducees come up and they ask him this ridiculously hard question. They're purposefully trying to trap him, and the scripture we're going to look at in just a second comes right after that story. So the atmosphere, the air in the room is so thick you can cut it. I mean, take a second. Think about a time you've been in a really relationally tense situation. I'm sure we've all been in it. The one that came to my mind, Mick and I, we were dating, and we actually did pre-engagement counseling back when we were dating. It was great. So we're in this class, and there was a couple who was teaching the class, and we were in a class talking about good, healthy communication and conflict management in your marriage, and the couple teaching the class got in this big fight during the class, and we're all sitting in the room like, oh, this is so weird. I think that feeling, that tension is what's in the air now when some Pharisees try their hand at trapping Jesus. This is Matthew 22, starting at verse 34. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. It's our turn. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. So the Sadducees couldn't trap Jesus, so the Pharisees, they take their turn, and their question is, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Now, at first glance, this might not seem like a trap, so let me help us understand why. A couple things. First thing to understand is this phrase, the law, because there's a lot of things that might be referred to by this term, the law. The law refers to a whole host of things. Jewish law had dietary law aspects, purity law, legal, ritual, property law. First decision Jesus has to make is the law refers to every conceivable area of life. So, in which area of life is Jesus' answer going to come from? Because the Pharisees or the Sadducees or other Jewish sects made greater importance or lesser importance of each of those areas. So where does Jesus stand on this debate? But second, we could think of the law in a lot of different ways. We have, of course, the Big Ten that Moses got from God on Mount Sinai in stone on the tablets. Is Jesus going to go for one of the Big Ten? I mean, come on. They're one of the Big Ten. They're written in stone. Probably a good answer. But if you've read Exodus, you know that the law didn't stop with the 10. There was the whole Sinai law, which I'm sure you all read in full when we studied through Exodus together, all 5 chapters of it, which has a ton of laws. But then if you back out, the first 5 books of the Bible as a whole have over 600 different specific laws. And then last but not least, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, those 5 as a whole are sometimes referred to as the law of Moses, or the Pentateuch, or the Torah. They thought it was so important that they came up with a bunch of different words to refer to it, which actually is like a real linguistic thing. Cultures name things with many names, the things they find more valuable. So Jesus, which one are you going to pick from when you answer the question, the greatest law? Okay, last thing about why this is a trap. It turns out that if you were an ancient rabbi, it was very common for you to go around and test other rabbis. You might sort of meet a new rabbi and you'd be like, all right, rabbi, let's see your rabbi chops. What kind of chops you got? The image that comes to mind is I think it's sort of like ancient rabbinic rap battles. That's what I think the rabbis did all the time, and the crowd's all around and they're like, oh, right, okay, so maybe a little different, but I don't know. And so we have in ancient literature a lot of the answers that rabbis gave to this very question. So let's consider some of the most famous answers to the question, which law is the greatest? Now, of course, you might start by thinking, hey, the Big Ten, they're a pretty big deal. We got to start with the Big Ten. And if you start with the Big Ten, it might be obvious to start with commandment number 1. And sure enough, commandment number 1 was one of the most popular answers of the day. It starts out, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, in case you forget, because you're prone to forget, who brought you out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. So many ancient rabbis said, this is clearly the right one and the only one. This one is more important than all the rest. There were some other rabbis who looked at the Big Ten and said, yeah, it comes from the Big Ten, but actually it's not the first one, it's another one. The second option, some rabbis argued for. I don't think it was as popular, but for me personally, being a father of 4 kids, I'm voting for this one. Some rabbis said, honor your father and your mother so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God has given you. And I'm like, children's ministry, Sheila, why don't we just make this the curriculum for all children's ministry? That would be fine with me. Some rabbis thought honor your father and your mother was the most important one. But then, some people, they didn't look at the Big Ten. They said, okay, yeah, we could start with the Big Ten, but we've got the whole Pentateuch, right? So another option comes from Leviticus 19. Some rabbis said the most important, the greatest commandment is, do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And so we see this idea in the rabbinic circles that maybe all of the laws somehow are connected to this idea of love your neighbor, and that holds them all together. And then, of course, there's one more that was very, very popular. It comes from the book of Deuteronomy, and it was actually a prayer that every faithful Jewish person, man, woman, child, every day of their life would pray every single morning and every single evening. It comes from Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 and 5. It's often referred to as the Shema, and Shema is the Hebrew word for hear or listen up, which is, of course, the first word of the verse. And it says, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. This part's the law. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. So the Pharisees know that there's a lot of different options. And they also know that different groups of Jewish people prefer different answers from among the different options. So what the Pharisees know is that no matter which answer Jesus gives, he's going to make somebody happy and he's going to tick somebody off. And what the Pharisees want is to cause division. Heck, maybe even some of his own disciples have their answers to this question. And maybe the Pharisees are thinking, if we can trip him up with this one, we're going to sow discord and discontent. We're going to tank the whole operation. But as you know, Jesus isn't just some random teacher. He's a ninja. So, which one is it, Jesus? What answer are you going to give? And Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And in my mind, the Pharisees are like, all right, I've got my response ready for this one. Here we go. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He continues and says, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. At which point, everybody's like, whoa, Jesus. I don't know if you skipped grammar back in 3rd grade, but we asked which is the greatest commandment. Greatest is in the superlative, and superlative means you can only choose one, Jesus. And Jesus is like, I don't play by your rules. You can't tell me what to do. What Jesus is doing here is something that nobody really did. You can't give 2 greatest commandments. But it's really just a setup. Jesus is clearly already pushing back on the Pharisees. And here's what in particular he's getting ready to reveal. See, in this whole discussion, in ancient rabbinic rap battle manner, there was language used in order to talk about all of these different laws. Because think about it. We've got 600 plus laws. Some of them, you shall not murder. Okay, that's a big deal. Like, this is a big. Other ones, for example, there's a law that said if you get mold in the walls of your house, you must scrub the walls every day for 7 days. And then afterwards, you must vacate the house for 2 full weeks. It's in Leviticus somewhere, something like that. I didn't, So hold on. If I murder someone or if I only scrub the walls for 6.5 days, if I break one of those 2 laws, like, which one's a bigger deal? They had language for it. They called them heavier laws or lighter laws. Some laws were heavier than others, and other laws were lighter than others. And the image that I get when I think about that language is it's like we've got 600 plus laws, and all of God's people had come to this point, and the Pharisees loved sort of piling the weight of this on people, so that what I'm doing is I'm walking around every day with 600 laws, trying to keep them in balance. Like, oh, this one's heavier, but this one's lighter, and I got to remember to scrub for 7 days, but I also can't murder anybody when I get so mad about how many days I have to scrub my walls. And it's this constant balancing act. But on top of that, if you were with us last week, the balancing act isn't just as though you're on a balance beam carrying these scales and all these weights, but you're also doing it as a broken person living in a broken world. And as you know, when you break things, there's a cost you have to pay. And I shared the story of the first time I experienced that cost. I was in 5th grade. I stole some baseball cards. I came home. My mom found me, and she looked at me and said, Carl, where'd you get those baseball cards? Suddenly, I felt guilt, and I felt the weight of shame, and I felt the weight of when you break things like laws, there's a cost, and that cost has a weight to it. And we talked about how all of us could quite possibly be walking around with the weight of all the broken things in our lives. But on top of all the weight of the broken things in our lives, we also have to balance all 600 plus of the laws, which is even harder when you've got a big weight on your back. Somebody said to me afterwards, Carl, how you should have ended that story was, parents, if your little kids are struggling with discipline problems, take encouragement, they might still turn out to be a pastor, right? This is a hopeful story. So the Pharisees are living in a world and in some ways creating a world where everybody's expected to carry a heavy weight on their back while balancing all these laws. And they've asked Jesus to speak into that world because they want to create division. And Jesus pushes back by saying there's not one greatest commandment, there's two: love God and love your neighbor. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He says something that had never been heard before. After saying love God and love your neighbor, he then says, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So first of all, Jesus doesn't just say which is the greatest law. He actually goes beyond it and includes all of the prophetic writings, which is another huge chunk of the Bible as well. Jesus says, you ask me what's the greatest commandment, I'm going to tell you what's greatest from the whole of the Hebrew Scriptures. And not only that, Jesus says, you want to know which commandment's heavier and lighter so we can keep them all in balance? Jesus says, no, we are done with that system. Because you all want to walk around keeping everything in balance, but here's what I'm going to do. He says, I'm going to go and I'm just going to wrap it all up. Every single one of the laws, every word from every prophet, everything we've learned from God, I'm going to pick it all up in a bag, and it's not going on any scales, but I'm going to hang it on one hook. And if it's not hanging on this hook, then none of it matters. Jesus completely overhauls the entire system. And he changes it from keeping things in balance, a relentless and taxing process. He changes it to remaining entirely dependent on the one and only thing. And the verse ends, the crowds were amazed at his teaching. And it turns out that this idea that Jesus gave, we got to stop trying to keep it all in balance. We got to stop trying to manage our image. We got to stop trying to do all those things. And we need to do the one and only most important thing, which is hang everything in our life on love for God that drives love for people. It turns out that actually stuck. We see it turn up in almost every single writing. Actually, I would say in some form, either explicitly or implicitly. We see it in every single writing, in every book of the New Testament. One of the famous ones comes from a guy named Paul, who was living his life trying to murder Christians. And when he encountered the risen Jesus, Jesus so changed his life that then he started he went on an international journey to start churches that would love one another and to raise funds to alleviate the famine happening back in Jerusalem. He went from murdering people to feeding hungry people. And here's one of the things Paul said that I think speaks directly to Jesus' answer. Paul said, if I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, this is a bit of a paraphrase, if I have the gift of prophecy, if I can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, if I have a faith that can move mountains, if I give all I possess to the poor, but do not have love, I am nothing. I gain nothing. Paul said, just like Jesus, I don't care what it is. All those other laws might be good. All of these things on this list might be good. Everything we're standing for might be good. But if I haven't hung it, fully dependent on this one hook, love God, love people, if I haven't hung it on that, then all I have is nothing. Jesus didn't actually end his teaching there. In this particular verse in Matthew, that's kind of the end of the passage, but Jesus expands this idea later because he sort of implied is, okay, Jesus, we heard it, this is a nice idea, this is a nice thought, but how do I really know what this looks like? How do I really know how to apply that in my life? What does this mean? What do I do with this? Where do I go with this in my life? Jesus answered it in a bunch of places, but particularly In the book of John, Jesus says, a new command I give to you. And that word command would have definitely brought up the 10 Commandments as well as the whole of the Torah. A new command I give to you. Love one another. What do you mean? What does that look like? How do I do that? Okay, let me tell you. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. Jesus is giving an invitation to look at and consider the way he lived his life and make that the way you live your life. And when he said these words, the disciples didn't quite know what that was going to look like yet, but he made it abundantly clear. He said, hey, you've all been walking around with weights on your back doing this balancing act because you're broken people in a broken world, and brokenness has a cost. But here's what I'm going to do. Jesus says, I'm going to come down, and I'm going to give my own life, and I will give what's mine to pay the cost for what you broke. And it's a simple question. Which one are you going to choose to live by? I think it's probably the hardest question of the morning. What law are you living by? Because the fact of the matter is, like the Pharisees of old had their versions and their arguments, we also create laws in our own lives. And we tell ourselves, okay, if I just follow this law enough, then maybe other people will like me. Maybe I'll get the approval I need. Maybe God will like me. Heck, maybe I'll actually eventually like myself if I just, and we fill in that blank with all sorts of different laws. And you see them at work all around you. You see them probably at work in your own life. I see them at work in my life. You might think, if I'm just good enough, if I just live by the law of moralism, then maybe everything will be right in my life. Or maybe if my relationships are healthy enough and other people like me, then everything will be right. Or maybe if I'm efficient and productive enough, because we live in a consumerist, capitalist economy, so if I'm productive, then everything will be right. Or maybe if I'm inspiring to people, or maybe if I am wise and knowledgeable enough, like Paul said. For some of us, we live by the law of security. Maybe if I keep me and my own safe and secure, then everything will be okay. For me, it's the joy of happiness. Maybe if I'm happy and the people around me are happy, then everything's going to be okay. Or for others, maybe it's the law of power and achievement. If I just get high enough up on the ladder, or maybe on the other side, you live by the law of peacemaking. If I can just keep everybody happy around me, maybe it's all okay. What about you? What law, if you're honest with yourself, when you live your life, when you speak your words, when you carry out your actions every day, in your relationships with friends, with family, at work, what law are you living by? I want to poke a little bit at one arena where I think this is particularly important. I don't know if you've noticed, but currently in our country, on the sort of national political level, there's a little bit of division happening. There's a little bit of tension. You might even call tension like Jesus was experiencing with the Pharisees back that you've noticed as well. Okay, it's not just me. I'm not the only one that noticed. Good. Some of us live by the law of whatever our political beliefs are. I would bet in this room, we've got conservatives and liberals, we've got Republicans, we've got Democrats, we've got people fully involved in the political world, we've got people who are like, count me out, I'm not doing anything. As a Jesus follower, no matter what our political beliefs, if those beliefs are not held and lived out on the hook, dependent, submitted to love for God and love for others, then they will be destructive. That is the only option for every political opinion we could possibly hear is we live it out faithfully, in dependence and submitted to love for God and love for people, or we live it out destructively and not according to God's will. And we see just how destructive things can be when they're not lived out by looking at Jesus and living the way he lived them. So what about you? Is the law you're living by going to look kind of like this? Volumes and volumes of rules and regulations and trying to keep them all in balance and carry the heavy weight on your back at the same time? Or are you going to accept Jesus' invitation to live a fully dependent life? If this hook breaks, I'm falling and they're all just hitting the floor. The dependent life is lived when we, if I would put it in shorter language, love God with everything. Every word we speak, every dollar we're given, every skill we have, every breath we take. We love God with everything. And from that, we then go and love people with everything as well. And that is something that everybody can do every day, everywhere they go. The ancient church teacher, Martin Luther, Reformation, said it this way: the relationship between Jesus and the Great Commandments is of cause and effect. Faith in Jesus gives believers the power of the Holy Spirit to keep, and forgiveness of sins for their inability to perfectly keep, God's great commandment. So Jesus said to his disciples long ago, and he says as well to every one of us, a new commandment I give to you. Love one another. In case you don't know what that means, in case that's fuzzy, in case that's not clear, here's what you do. Look at Jesus. Take your eyes and put them on the life, the teaching, the death, the resurrection of Jesus. As I have loved you, Jesus said, so you must love one another. If you see Jesus doing something, do that in your life. If you see Jesus going somewhere, go there in your life. Wherever you find Jesus, put your whole life right there, and everything else comes second to that. Everything else comes second to that. Yeah, but what about everything else comes second to that? Yeah, but what about this? I mean, but Carl, but this. No. Everything else comes second to loving God, loving people as Jesus loved us. So what do we do with that? Here's how I want to give us some space to let this sink in. Worship team's going to come back up, and we'll put the lights down, and we're going to create a little space for some prayer, and I'm going to prompt you to simply let God speak that and put that and soak that into your life in a few ways. And here's why. As you know, just hearing something, right? We heard these words, and maybe, hopefully, you're all going, yes, I want to do that. But like the disciples of old and like we just see around us, just hearing something doesn't mean it's going to soak in deep. Here's the illustration I like to use to kind of give us a picture of what we're trying to do. Imagine it's summer, and you're going to have some people over for a barbecue. And maybe you're like me, and you get home at 4:45, and you think, shoot, they're going to be here in 30 minutes. So you open the freezer and you pull the chicken out and you chuck it into the microwave and you're like, defrost, baby. And then ding, and you pull it out and you get your spices and your sauce and the soy sauce, a little cumin, whatever you put, and you quick just like throw it on there, and then grill's open, you toss it on the grill. Dinner's gonna be ready. Or maybe you're more like my wife, who's like, people are coming over tomorrow night. So tonight, I'm going to pull the chicken out of the fridge out of the freezer, so that in the morning, heck, I'm going to open the bag and I'm going to take the exact same spices, right? I'm going to take the same cumin, the same soy sauce, the same whatever. I'm going to put the exact same stuff in a bag and I'm going to Ziploc it and put it in the fridge. So that when our friends come over, it's been marinating. It's been soaking for 10 hours. And then I put it on the grill. Which chicken's going to taste better? And so it is with our lives. You could put the exact same truth from God. You could hear the exact same commandment from him. But if we don't create space to let it soak in, the flavors will not get as deep in our lives. So they're going to play two refrains from the song, O Come, Emmanuel. The promise that we can rejoice that Emmanuel has come to cover all of the cost for all the brokenness in our lives. We'll sing it twice, and then I'll prompt you 3 times to pray for the love of God to be the one and only thing, the hook upon which you hang everything in your life. And Lord, we ask in this space that indeed your love would soak deep into our lives today. Amen.